Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar Wednesday. I'm Dr. Allison Ross. I am one of your training and implementation specialists here at Eduphoria. And today, as a part of our Design for Impact webinar series, we have the absolutely wonderful Dr. Amy Magnifique-Strong. She is an educator with over 29 years of field experience, who is the owner of the communications and educational consulting firm AP Business Solutions. She is also a very good friend of mine, and her amazing work extends into her role as the Intellectual Freedom Chair for the Illinois Association of Teachers of English. Today, Dr. Strong is joining us to discuss advocacy through belonging. Dr. Strong, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Dr. Ross. It's a real pleasure.
What can you tell us about advocacy through belonging?
Advocacy through belonging is a way to foster community among your students, but also for your students to feel like schooling, education is something beyond just passing a class or doing well on a state exam, that it has real meat and meaning outside of their school life. And one of the goals I think we want in education spaces, especially K through 12 schools, is to create the next generation of leaders. So in order to do that, we need to be teaching students early on how to advocate not only for themselves, but for their communities and the wider world through the curriculum they sort of engage with at school. So we do that by first fostering belonging in our students. It's no small thing to say that through decades and decades of research, we have learned as educators that students do better in school when their engagement is nurtured in an environment of belonging. So when students feel like they belong in spaces in their schools, they feel empowered to not only advocate for themselves, but for their peers and for their communities. That sense of belonging lets them feel like they matter beyond just a score for the school or doing well in a particular class. So how do we create belonging in schools? Well, first and foremost, we have to nurture student empowerment. And we do that by inspiring our students to voice their opinions. They have opinions and they have knowledge beyond what they've learned in school. In fact, almost all students come into school spaces with what Louise Malle studied in the 1990s and coined funds of knowledge. So students all have this fund of knowledge within them when they enter our schools, but that knowledge might not necessarily be traditional school knowledge. That doesn't mean the things they know and the things they've experienced aren't powerful or impactful in the school curriculum. It's a matter of finding a way to use their funds of knowledge to scaffold into the school curriculum and the knowledge the school wants them to know. And so that also calls upon some very old but powerful research from the 60s by Lev Vygotsky in his zones of proximal development, that in order for students to learn anything new, it has to be close to something they already know. And that something doesn't have to be a piece of school knowledge. It could be a piece of knowledge from their family, their community, their experiences outside of the school space. Once we nurture their voice, go ahead. Did you have a question?
Oh, I was just thinking as we talked about Vygotsky, would you also say that what you're speaking to also parallels as we are leaders training fellow educators?
Oh, absolutely. I think the idea of scaffolding and the idea of funds of knowledge should apply in every space where we have people working together, whether they're students, whether they're teachers in the same school or across schools, whether it's in the workplace, in a business, in a company, in a corporation. Engaging with the people we are working with, however we're defining that work, is about nurturing their belonging in that space and realizing that although their knowledge might be different than ours, that doesn't mean that their knowledge is inconsequential. Does that help your
No,
question?
that's perfect. I really appreciate you making that connection. So many times folks that tune into our webinars are also teaching peers in their district, they're teaching their teachers, they're teaching their staff. And so I really think that this element of belonging belongs in any type of process where we're learning and trying to bring together a group of people to accomplish an objective. So I love how you tie that back to very sage research that has time tested from Vygotsky.
Right. And, part of Vygotsky's research also said that social interactions are paramount to development. Now, of course, he was talking about children and students, right? That social interactions have to be a part of schooling and their curriculum. But I would say that those social interactions are just as important in spaces where there's educators teaching fellow educators, or there's professional development of any kind going on, right? If we can't have positive, strong social interactions, then we're not going to develop beyond what we already know. And as educators, I would hope that, of course, we believe in lifelong learning, right? And so those social actions will be very important. After we empower and nurture our students to utilize the knowledge they already come into our educational spaces with, then we need to strengthen peer support networks. So it's very difficult in my mind to create peer collaborations among students who may see themselves as very different from each other if we don't first allow all of them to utilize their knowledge in front of their peers, even though that knowledge might be different from each other. By doing that, it shows that every voice is valued. And by doing that, then you can encourage collaboration, because what more than likely is going to happen is in groups of students who see themselves as very different from each other, different background, different community they've grown up, different family dynamic, however we define that, when we allow them to share their knowledge and their background from outside of school, they end up seeing that they have a lot more shared experiences than they realized, because now they're seeing the inner workings of their peers and not just an outer sort of dressing of their peers. And so we then encourage that collaboration and to find where they have shared experiences, and maybe they don't have a particular shared experience, but they can learn from each other. That strengthens their peer network and their support. And ultimately, we want our students to be supporting each other, even when they're vastly different from each other, right? It goes to empathy. And so encouraging that collaboration based on having allowed them to share their funds of knowledge goes a long way to that. And then the third step in creating that belonging is then building a vibrant community within your school. So those school connections have to go beyond peer-to-peer connections. We need to foster connections between administration and faculty and staff, and between faculty to faculty. And we need to include students in all of those connections, fostering connection between students and administration, students and faculty, students and staff. we have to create a safe space and a sense of belonging for everyone in that school community to make connections and collaborate together. When we do that, we lead to what will become impactful advocacy efforts and ultimately student success, as well as educator success. I mean, we could take it that far as well. So once we've done that, once we've built that community, now we can work on student advocacy, fostering belonging through active student engagement, and we do that with differentiated instruction. So part of that differentiation of instruction to create student advocates and students who are advocates goes to something that is paramount in teaching literature, right? So I was an English language arts high school level teacher for a long time, as well as teaching composition and education courses at the university level. And one of the things in teaching literature we always want to do is we want to foster students connecting a text they're reading to another text they've read. We want them to connect a text to themselves, and we want them to connect a text to the larger world outside of them. It's the same thing in creating student advocacy. And when we develop their using their funds of knowledge, and we're scaffolding, we want them to be able to connect the curriculum they learn in school to other curriculum in school, right? And we want them to then take that curriculum in school and be able to connect it to something important in themselves. And we want them to take that curriculum in school and connect it to their communities outside of school or out to a wider world. And when they can take what they're learning in school and connect it to their community, the wider world, then we're actually showing them how to be advocates, not only for themselves, but for others. So the first step is inception. We empower them to share their voices actively. We have to value what they have to say, first and foremost. Second, we build awareness off of that. So within the school, creating workshops that teach advocacy skills effectively. You can do that by bringing people who work in advocacy into the school. Well, what kind of skills do they need to do the advocacy work they're doing in the community of the school? And having students ask them questions and see that they have the potential to do that as well. The third step is now developing those skills and having the school host events to promote student-led initiatives. So for example, when I was teaching honors sophomore English, we read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And as a culminating project, I had students come up with a modern monster in the world that they could come up with a plan to fix. And that modern monster could be something like hunger in their community. And the students shared these projects by coming up with plans to fight that modern monster. So, for example, I did have a student who came up with a plan to better boost the food bank in our community. I had another student who was very much into animal welfare, and she came up with a project to bring more awareness to animal cruelty because she saw that as a modern monster in the world. And we gave the students a forum in the school to share these projects, which were all advocacy. We weren't calling it that way back then, but it was the same thing as advocacy. The second is action, to develop partnerships with local community organizations and have students collaborate, especially if they've seen a particular problem they want to address in their community, and they can go to an advocacy group, a local community group like a food bank, to help bring their initiatives and their ideas to fruition. All of that, creating advocacy and belonging, actually helps build essential skills, not just for advocacy, but for all the work students are going to do in the curriculum within the school and the work we want them to be able to do when they leave their formal education behind. We don't want that to stop. All of this actually creates 6 really important skills to be utilized everywhere for the rest of their lives. One is communication skills. Obviously, we want students to be able to clearly express themselves. But I am a firm believer in giving them the opportunity to communicate about things they are passionate about. We can use that within the curriculum. Their communication doesn't always have to be that formal essay or that formal speech. We want them to see that those skills can be used outside of the school, that the school is about more than just what they need to do to get through school, right? Using advocacy and belonging in the curriculum helps critical thinking. Of course, we want all our students to be critical thinkers. We want them to analyze. We want them to critique. We want them to have a voice beyond just answering a question in the classroom. It also creates collaboration skills. I mean, in order to set on this path of creating advocates and advocacy for students, we talked about how they have to first learn to collaborate with their peers and then collaborate with their teachers and their administrators and the staff, and then collaborate outside of the school. Those skills are going to be used for the rest of their life. They're always going to have to be working with, speaking with someone, whether it's in their family, whether it's in their community, whether it's at their job. Those skills will be strengthened. Obviously, we want them to be leaders. We want them to inspire others. And we want them to be able to engage in calls to action. Empathy development. Empathy development. All 6 of these are equally important, but I don't think any of them mean as much without that empathy piece, right? Understanding different perspectives, understanding that not everyone is going to be like you, and that's okay, but you can come to some sort of common ground and understanding. And to advocate for those who aren't like you in the hopes that by doing so, they will advocate back for you. And then, of course, resource management. If you're asking students to develop advocacy initiatives, not only for themselves or initiatives within their school, but beyond the community, they're going to have to use a lot of resources and know how to manage them effectively. So having them research the kind of tools that they need to use to create a food bank project or to create a initiative within their school to better support their school community. Having to deal with all of those resources, all of those moving parts is really important.
You know, this makes me think of Ewan McIntosh's TEDx London discussion where he talked about students as problem finders. So as they're building empathy, they're able to look at their community and not be solution finders for problems, but actually see where problems are that they could find solutions for. And I feel like as you're talking about this, I'm hearing a lot of echoes of that and just how truly important empathy is for our students to be able to engage in looking at something from different perspectives and then use those critical thinking skills and all of the other elements that you described to put together like truly pragmatic solutions. So it made me think about that as you were talking about it.
Oh, I think they're intertwined, right? And that whole piece, for example, the Frankenstein unit that I mentioned earlier, that final piece of finding a modern monster was really all about finding a modern problem that you can have an impact on, right? Where are there problems? And not only finding, naming it, exposing it, but then going through, well, but then what do we do about it? Right. And that's what a lot of students would say. Yeah. So now what? Well, the big now what is, well, how do you impact that problem that you've exposed or you've discovered or you've uncovered, right? The big so what is, what are you going to do about it? And to give students the opportunity to see that they actually can do something about A, B, or C, right? That they have this impact. They have the ability to be change makers even now while they're still in school, whether it's grade school, middle school, high school, college, doesn't matter. Even kids in grade school can be taught that they have a voice and can have impact, whether it's in their school or in their community. I just think that it goes a long way to showing them that they're valued, important. And that all starts with belonging. If students don't feel like they're being seen, they're being heard, they're being respected, then they don't feel the need to engage in school in any way, right? And that matters, that they have adults, and I would go so far as to say not just educators in the building, but mentors within that building that on a daily basis sees them, hears them, values them. Let's face it, some of our students don't get that at home, right? Depending on what situation they're coming from. So to have people for 8 hours in a school day who give them that is so incredibly powerful, and meaningful, not only to them being successful in school, but in being successful outside of school on a daily basis and beyond as they become adults. We want them to be engaged in positive change, but we can't do that with them unless we're showing them that we see all the positives in them, even the positives that don't fit into the typical school curriculum, right? We don't want them to be little automatons who are all exactly the same. What does that get us in the wider world if everybody is exactly the same and they all have the exact same knowledge and abilities? It makes for poor problem solvers later, right? So for me, the belonging, the advocacy is about the impact that they can not only have now in their classrooms and in their communities, but the impact they can have decades from now. And if you have any questions about advocacy or belonging, please go ahead and ask me, Dr. Ross. I'd appreciate it.
Well, first of all, this was such a great presentation to really share out with our webinar Wednesday listeners. One thing I was thinking about as you were talking, Dr. Strong, is about, if I am a teacher in elementary, middle school, high school, and I'm hearing this webinar, what's that first step I should take? Like, I'm like, okay, I want to build belonging within my classroom. I want to foster student agency. What is the first step I could make in my lesson plans tomorrow?
This is probably going to sound strange, but I think one of the first things we can do as educators is allow students to tell us about something they know how to do or they know about that isn't necessarily a part of the school curriculum, and share it, right? Like, you have that student, that young man in class who maybe is a reluctant learner, maybe really doesn't like to read, but he can take apart an engine and put it back together, right? Even if
Right.
it's just at this point, a lawnmower engine. he has a fund of knowledge that doesn't necessarily fit into the school traditional curriculum, but man, he knows some stuff, right? And so having him share that, yeah, this is something about me maybe you all don't know. Like, I love taking things apart and putting them back together. And here's something I've done. Even if he shares pictures, right, of that process, or he brings a small piece of something into the classroom and shows how it works. I think we can immediately acknowledge that our students have these knowledges beyond school that we want to say, but we know you know things and we're going to value them in this space.
I
And
love
when we show that we're going to value those different knowledges in that space, they become more comfortable with learning new knowledge.
And I feel
And
like
it's easy. It's
exactly.
like it's like so show and tell on steroids, right?
Yes. Yes. I feel like this is like the what you have shared, the sage teachings you've shared here are applicable from pre-K all the way through college, right? So like every
Absolutely.
student wants to be able to bring who they are into the space and have that connect to what's being learned. I in my time in education, I am yet to be disproven on that theory. It's where if a student feels like they belong, they flourish, they thrive. So I this is such like a powerful element to add to any learning environment is teaching students to connect with each other, with themselves, within their own abilities, and with their greater community.
Well, and it also provides their peers an opportunity to be like, oh, that's really cool. I want to know more about that. And it might have them talk to someone they wouldn't have otherwise spoken to, right? A peer. Or as the educator in the room, the mentor in the room, you could say, does anyone in here have a skill or a fund of knowledge that might tie into so and so's love of taking things apart and putting them back together, right? So now you're asking them to think critically about what they've learned from the student and how they might utilize it in something they do or they enjoy, right? And you also have to create that safe space that no matter how weird or bizarre someone's fund of knowledge might seem to you, we're going to respect that they're passionate about it and they love it. We don't have to necessarily want to start doing it ourselves, right? Like the girl who loves knitting booties for her cat. I actually have a student like that, and I thought it was amazing. Somebody else might think that's really bizarre, but you have to create that space where nothing is weird and nothing is bizarre. It's just different, and everybody has the joy of finding the things that bring them joy, right? And so I think that's a powerful piece as well to the peer building and the collaboration.
I love that. I was talking to my teammates today, the other Eduphoria trainers, and I was talking about my time as a history teacher and how I made it all into a story and really help the students connect that to a story that they know, and that was and you used a really powerful word there, joy. The joy
Yes.
that they had when they were able to connect and get excited about learning. And it's so true. We are in this business to engage lifelong learners, and we want them to be able to be prepared for whatever comes next. And they're connected to what they need to know in their preparation.
That joy is so important. And when I was teaching methods of teaching writing to pre-service high school English teachers at a university in Illinois, um, I used to ask them at the beginning of that course, well, what do you want your students to get out of sitting in your English classroom in high school? And I used to at the beginning get those very typical pat answers of early pre-service educators, right? I want them to love reading. I want them to become really good writers and love writing. And I used to say, that's not your goal. And they would say, what? And I'm like, well, of course you want them to be effective communicators and effective writers and be effective readers. But your goal isn't to turn them into mini-me's. Your goal isn't to turn them into future English teachers. Your goal is to give them these skills that they can use in the thing that brings them joy and that brings them satisfaction, that they can apply it to whatever it is they choose to do in the future, right? And so I think you get more from your students when you say, well, yes, my curriculum's important, but the end all be all of my curriculum is that they can glean something from it and take these skills from it and turn it into something else, right? Or utilize it in the way they want to walk through this world. Of course, I would love every kid in my English class that I ever taught to love reading, but that wasn't my goal. My goal was to teach them the kinds of skills with reading and writing for them to be successful wherever they landed after school.
Love that. I think that's the heart of every educator. Um, well, Dr. Strong, thank you so much for joining us today on our webinar Wednesday. This has been such a great time of learning for everyone. Please connect with Dr. Strong. Here is her contact information. Or if you're always welcome to reach out to us here at Eduphoria, training@eduphoria.net. We are going to have a little Q&A. If you do have questions, you can pop them into the Q&A now in the webinar. We can always follow up with you. And we thank you so much, Dr. Strong, for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Dr. Ross. It's been a pleasure.